He's not paying attention. No, you're right. Madam Court Reporter, can you hear us?
I can hear you now. It did drop off. And
Okay.
It dropped off where the commissioner was saying, I don't remember if you remember that one.
We'll have the doctor reiterate his question. We just want to make sure that you're on and that you can hear us.
Thank you.
Thank you, doctor. I apologize.
No problem. Thank you. So you've done some, let's say, analysis here using more of the law based on the saturation. So I get that. And that more or less become all of your mean. But when I say that this probably is not sensitivity analysis, even though you are showing us high and low based on some assumptions, based on some assumptions. As petroleum, in our petroleum business, we do have a way of actually representing our volumes. And that is based on uncertainty analysis. And that is the one that I'm talking about. And when we get on the break, I can check and see that that document and then probably reference that. Now, with these volumes that has been presented to us, do you know how much of this is recoverable?
I do not. That would be an engineering question.
So is that something that probably Scott is going to speak to?
Scott is not an engineer. He's a petrophysicist. I suspect that you'll get that from one of the engineers that are testifying.
Okay. So there is a possibility that the recovery factor here could be 0, right?
I'm not it's not my expertise to speak on that.
Okay. Let me check to see if I have any other questions. I think I'll probably reserve my other questions for the petrophysicist. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bailey.
Good
Thank
afternoon.
you for testifying this afternoon. I think I just have one question that wasn't covered already. Can you speak a little bit more to what you see as the underlying flaws to the methodology for determining tops that Goodnight uses as far as pressure differentials between zones?
Yeah, I think that it's I've tried to make it clear, and I think we'll go through some more of this, but I've tried to make it clear that they did do the research, right? So we have outcrop tied to subsurface along, as I mentioned, along the Northwest Shelf, the stratigraphy, San Andreas, Lovington Stand, still present. It's consistent, and obviously we have the core data that clearly Goodnight, I don't know whether they used it. I don't know if they understand what the stratigraphy is. What I will say is that moving your top up and down on pressure boundaries or where you may have taken losses in mud is not geology. And it neglects the literature, the experts that have come in here and done all the outcrop work and tied this to subsurface, and neglects the stratigraphic model. We have not created anything new here. We've just done the homework. That's all it took. Is I came in, I do the research, I contact the experts that have worked in this field for decades. I get their opinions and what they've worked on and try to understand it and then put a model together. And that's all I've done. And having the two cores make it very, very clear. And then as I use the logs across there, which I think are fairly simple to correlate across in most cases, I think it's a simple model that is consistent with what's been done in the past. I don't think what they've done, and I think they admit that, it's not geology, it's engineering.
Thank you for that response. I think the only other question I had is, in your opinion, do you think that any disposal into the San Andreas in commercial quantities is inadvisable?
I do. I think you're causing harm to Empire. I don't think it's, I know Bob said this, but they're the operator of the EMSU. Okay, they're the operator. They run the EMSU unit. They paid for it. They bought it. Whether you think they're going to go do EOR, I do. I know they have some tests they plan. And I think that they should have the opportunity to go in and actually test this without having continued water injection influencing what could happen in the San Andres, or furthermore, overpressuring the San Andres and having breakthrough into the Grayburg where it causes damage to their existing Grayburg producers. I think it's a very fine line and very dangerous.
Thank you. No more questions.
I thank you for your testimony today. I don't have any questions. Thank you. Can you turn on your microphone, Mr. Hearing Examiner?
No questions. All right, then Ms. Hardy, redirect.
Yes, thank you. I don't think this will take too long. Mr. Bailey, Mr. Rankin was questioning you earlier. He asked several questions about your experience in evaluating different formations.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall those questions?
I do, yes, ma'am.
And do you follow the same general geological principles of reservoir characterization when you are evaluating different formations?
Yes, we do. That is the standard workflow we use, and it's been tried and true. We typically have repeat clients for it, as we do a lot of A&D evaluations.
Mr. Rankin asked you several questions about whether the San Andres and Grayburg function as separate reservoirs. Do you remember those questions?
I do.
Okay. And I think you stated that they are different from a geological standpoint,
That is correct.
but can fluid migrate between them?
I believe it can, yes.
Mr. Rankin also asked you questions about XTO's sales documents. Do you recall those questions?
I do.
And do you have experience with XTO's reservoir evaluations?
I have some experience with them, yes.
And in your experience, are they generally reliable?
They're generally very thorough. Certainly on the geology side, I mean, they're generally recognized as the fathers of sequence stratigraphy, so they know what they're doing.
Mr. Rankin asked you a number of questions about the state geologist formation top picks for the MSU 628 included in the NMOCD well file. Do you recall those questions?
I do, yes.
And he showed you a document from the well file?
Yes, he did.
Okay. I'm going to pull up that document here, or and as well as some others, and ask you about them. Actually, so is this another document from that same well file? Oh, I'm not sharing my screen.
We could show the same one that Mr. Rankin showed. We can also show what the operator provided as the tops, and then we can go well by well, so that the council here can see that even the OCD varies their tops from well to well, depending on, I guess, where the state geologist wanted to put them.
Okay, and can you identify this document that I've pulled up here on the screen?
Yes, I can.
And what is it?
That is the MSU 628 wellbore with the perfs that XTO had within the well.
And
So
is this the same well that Mr. Rankin showed you?
It is, yes.
Okay.
This is 628. So you can see at the bottom, and I think this is important for everyone to see. The San Andres perfs, as I documented in my testimony, as they have labeled, they have the Grayburg perfs labeled Zone 1, 2, Zone 2A, Zone 3, 4, 5, 6, and then SA is San Andres. San Andres perfs at 3918 to 24. If we go back to the cross section, and I believe that was K14.
Here. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong thing. Let me just. Let me just stop sharing for one moment and get this pulled back up. You said it's the K14?
I believe it's K14, yeah. It's a cross section. I want to get this across because only half the story is there when you show just what the state geologist picked. And so that's the importance of this. So in 628, you can see perf starting designated at 3918 measured depth. by XTO as reported to the state, and we just showed you that document, at 3918, that's exactly where our top of San Andreas is. Those are San Andreas PERS provided by the operator. Now, if you go back to what the state geologist decided, I believe Mr. Rankin pointed out that he had a top of 4075, which is where Goodnight put their top. So that's already inconsistent with what the operator reported. Now let's go to the 658. Can you go to the 658? Do you have it up?
I believe
Yeah, okay, good.
Yeah.
Let's scroll down a little bit. You can see the San Andreas perf is at 3995 to 4004. Everybody agree with that? We can all see that? Zoom in there. We got it 3995 to 4004. It's top of San Andreas is reported by XTO to the state. Now, can we go to the state geologist where he reported the top?
Let me just pull that one up. For the 658.
That is correct. Yes.
Sorry, I'm having to switch back and forth between
It's okay.
what I'm showing here.
That's great. So they reported the top for the 658, and the state geologist reported it at 3949. Now, if you'll go back to the cross section, please. If you'll recognize where the top of our, on 658, where we have the top of the San Andreas. The top of the San Andreas is about 3950, sits right in the middle. Would you all agree? And you can see that correlation from the 628 to the 658. So the state geologist reported in this well the exact top that that the operator reported, but yet in the 628 they didn't. So let's do one more. Let's do 713.
There it is, right?
Okay, so 713. We don't have a top of San Andreas here as reported by XTO, but what we do have is a cast iron bridge plug set at 4052. Now, would you please go back to the state geologist top for this well? Even though the operator didn't report a top of San Andreas, the state geologist has a top at 3942. Can we go back to the cross section?
Sorry, I'm having a getting.
It's all right. You're
My
close.
computer is not liking what I'm trying to do here. There we go.
So let's look at this. So the cast iron bridge plug that the operator reported is right there. You can see it in the pink bar in the depth track, in the measured depth track. About 4052 is the bottom of it. But yet the state geologist reported the top 3942. Now, doctor, you asked me, maybe I need to talk to the OCD. I think you can look at this cross section and you can certainly see the top of the Grayberg. I think you can certainly see correlating our top of the San Andreas. Can you? Where we have the top of the San Andreas, do you agree across those sections that that looks the same? Okay, I apologize. I'm just saying
Yeah, that'll be
to me, and I don't mean to. I apologize for putting you on the spot, but I think that most people in the room could look at this and see that the tops correlated across here are very consistent. And the inconsistent thing is what's been reported by the operator and what's being put down as the OCD top. So if Goodnight went by what was done by the OCD, then their top would have to be up in the Grayberg, which would be inconsistent with what thicknesses they're predicting for the Grayberg. It would certainly be significantly less than the 400 feet that they're expecting.
Mr. Bailey, is there anything else that you wanted to add about these?
I don't. I think that there's a diagnostic signature for the top of San Andreas. We know we have the Lovington sand that's sitting in the middle. You've got to be above it. I think that the neutron density curve, the bulk density curve, give you a great indication of where the top of that is. I think that there is some areas where you have some porosity, like you see in 628 at the top of it. But you can see the gamma ray signature is very consistent through here. I think in my case, as I keep saying, I think it's fairly easy to correlate. I think this section, and I've looked at a lot of logs, and it's probably not fair to everyone else, but to me, it seems very easy to correlate.
And Mr. Hearing Examiner and Commissioners, I would like to move the 3 XTO documents as exhibits. Since Mr. Rankin had identified part of the well file for one of those, I think they need to be admitted in the interest of completeness.
You have numbers for them, or?
They can be, in terms of the exhibit numbers?
Sure, for the record.
Yes, for the record, let me just get to, I think they would be K 57, 58, and 59.
Mr.
We
Rankin,
need all
No objection.
6 of them.
objections from OCD.
No objection, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Mr. Beck,
No objection.
any objection from Pilot?
No objection, Mr. Hearing Examiner.
Okay, they'll be admitted.
Mr. Hearing Examiner, if I may, if we could just ensure that those are emailed to all parties as well as to Ms. Apodaca.
I will do that. And I also wanted to include the state geologist pics that we referenced along with each matching well.
As part of these numbered exhibits.
Yes, correct.
Do I need to go through the objection thing again? If I hear silence, I'll assume those are part of those exhibits. And I hear silence. They'll be made part of them.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey, I just have a couple of other questions for you. If we can look at your exhibit K14 there. Can you go through, and maybe you already did this with respect to the state geologist pics, but let me know, and just summarize the tops of the formations and what you're showing on that exhibit?
Yeah, I'm showing the top of the Grayberg, the top of the San Andreas, the Lovington sand, the San Andreas Goodnight pics for the 628 and 658 that I had, as well as the lower San Andreas.
And if we look at your cross-section K6 or exhibit K6, is this the one I went to look for? Does this show the top of the Lovington sand?
It does. It shows it below the premier sand, below the top of the San Andreas formation.
Let me just make sure that those are all of my questions. That's it. I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. May this witness be excused.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I know that you're not eager to open doors for recross. However, there were a couple comments that Mr. Bailey made on his response to redirect that I believe I need to address or ask a couple questions about. And if you'd like, I can explain what they are and why.
No, go ahead. It's an informal hearing, but
Yeah,
I
know
may
it's-
regret this.
Mr. Bailey, in your comment, you made the comment that about Goodnight's, what Goodnight did or didn't do with the core as part of its effort to identify the top of the San Andreas. You don't know, as you sit there, whether Goodnight Midstream had available to it the RR Bell #4 core or the EMSU 679 core at the time it made its picks, do you?
I do know that they had access to the RBL core. They did not use the RBL core.
Let me ask you again. As you sit here, you don't know whether Goodnight Midstream had access to those cores at the time it made those picks, do you?
I don't know.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey, you were asked about whether or not the injection into the San Andreas is causing harm to the San Andreas and to Empire. And you said in response that Empire has some tests. And I don't know what those tests are. And I'm wondering what tests you're talking about.
I'm suggesting that they have the game plan to go and test the potential for the San Andreas ROS.
Okay, so you're telling me that what you most misspoke because they don't have any tests at this point.
I'm not saying they have current tests. I'm saying that they're expected to go figure out whether they can make this work as a potential ROS zone.
I misheard you then because I thought you said that they have tests. So I wanted to make sure I understood that. When Ms. Hardy was asking you questions about XTO and your experience with XTO, you told her that your experience with XTO is that they're reliable. Their evaluations are reliable, right?
In general, I believe so, yes. Anything that comes from Exxon has pretty strong oversight.
Now, in your exhibit K55, you identified your analysis for oil in place, right?
Mhm.
And as I understand your testimony is that the low case and the high case this is all limited to the exterior boundaries of this EMSU, correct?
It is just the blue box. That is correct.
Okay. So for example, the upper San Andreas, your low case is 190 million barrels for that blue box.
That's correct.
And for the lower San Andreas, your low case is 438 million barrels for that blue box, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, but you told me also that previously that you had looked at XTO's brochure promoting the potential upsides in the EMSU and the 3 units, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And in that brochure, which is part of Mr. Wheeler's exhibit packet, I believe it's exhibit. Oh, it's exhibit A5. It identifies all 3 exhibits, rather all 3 units. And it shows a type log for the 3 units with a 900 million barrel oil in place assessment for all 3 units. You see that? Okay. But your analysis is that the EMSU alone on the low case is 629 million barrels.
Okay.
That's a substantial difference than XTO.
I haven't done the analysis on AGU or EMSUB, so I don't know what the ranges are for either of those. If you have those, I'd certainly love to see them.
Okay. So, but even on the high side, you're estimating 1 billion barrels, which is just for the EMSU.
I would like you to keep in mind that we evaluated the total San Andreas. They cut it off at 700 subsea TVD. So we have additional footage that we're including in that value.
Say that again. So
they cut it off at the base of the ROS, which is they have at 700 subsea. We continue to use all our wells all the way down to the Glorietta. So we have additional footage we're including in our values.
Okay. So maybe more apples to apples would be to compare your lower San Andreas to.
No, I think that if we cut ours off at 700 subsea for the actual calculation, that our numbers would come down to whatever their numbers probably were likely closer to what they have.
Okay.
The upper San Andreas would not change, the lower San Andreas would.
But wouldn't they both have to change?
No, because the base of the ROS is below the upper San Andreas.
When Dr. Mpoma was asking you about trying to pick the San Andreas top, had a question there. Because you're relating to relying heavily on the Lovington sand. Okay, identifying the Lovington sand, knowing then that the top's going to be above that, right?
That's an important marker, yes.
Because above the Lovington sand, then you got the Premier sand, right?
The Premier sand would be at the base of the Grayburg.
Okay, so. But as we understand from Dr. Lindsay's testimony and his, substantial work on the EMSU and the Grayburg, that the EMSU and the Grayburg was subaerial exposed numerous times, right?
Yes, within sequences, high frequency sequences. Yeah.
Okay, and it's possible and it's likely, and is it? Let me ask you this: is the top of the San Andreas actually is it an unconformity?
It is. It's a composite nonconformity.
Okay. And so,
Sequence boundary, excuse me.
so over time, when the sea surface receded, isn't it possible that there could be erosion that would have cut through the unconformities?
There could be collapse over time for sure. Yeah. And so what you might see is collapse breccias, which may indicate where you're seeing some of that tighter neutron that doesn't have the porosity associated with the gamma ray signature.
Well, I'm not actually talking about collapse breccias. I'm talking about actually erosion through time, cutting through time, resulting in loss of features, right? across the field.
What you would see is actually karsting. You would not see significant amount of erosion on the dolomites themselves. You might see karsting collapsing. So I don't know if you're arguing that we have 150 feet of erosion occurring over the period between the San Andreas and Grayburg. I would tell you that that's not occurring.
So you haven't seen that?
No.
Okay.
Mr. Rankin, you're
Yeah.
beyond two questions and
I'm done.
questions that were
I'm done.
asked on redirect.
I'm
So, are you done?
I am done. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So may this witness be excused.
No objection from OCD.
No objection from pilot.
And Rice and Pilot?
Yeah, the witness may be excused.
Okay. All right, Mr. Bailey, thank you. We'll take a break at 3:00. So we've got 30 more minutes. Why don't we start with, is it going to be Scott Burkhead?
Correct. Scott Burkhead is our next witness.
Okay. Is that okay with the commission? You guys want to break now or you want to go till 3?
I'm good.
All right. All right, let's press on then.
I think there's one here that's in. So watch out for the microphone.
All right, Mr. Burkhead, is that seat very hot?
It's pretty warm. Thank you.
Are you ready to proceed?
Yes, sir.
If you'll raise your right hand. You swear to affirm the testimony you give here today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury.
Yes, sir.
Right, thank you. Ms. Hardy.
Ms. Shaheen is actually presenting Mr. Burkhead.
Oh, okay.
I am sharing now. Mr. Burkhead, could you please state your name and spell it for the record?
Stanley Scott Burkhead. The last name is Birkhead.
By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I own my own petrophysical consulting company. I was brought on by Ops Geologic to help out Empire with this endeavor.
What is your area of expertise?
Petrophysics.
And how does your testimony today compare to Mr. Bailey's testimony?
It's additive.
Would it be fair to say that Mr. Bailey testified about the geology and you're going to be testifying primarily about saturations?
Yes, ma'am. I'll be testifying about the petrophysical characteristics.
Have you testified before the commission or the division before?
No, ma'am.
And you've attached your credentials to your written testimony in this manner, which is Exhibit L, and your credentials are attached as Exhibit L53. Is that right?
Yes.
I would ask that Mr. Burkhead be qualified as an expert witness in petrophysics in this matter.
Any objection from Goodnight?
No objection.
OCD?
No objection.
Rice?
No objection.
Pilot?
No objection.
You will be so recognized.
Thank you. And your rebuttal testimony, your written rebuttal testimony was submitted in this matter as Empire's Exhibit L. Is that right?
Correct.
Do you have any changes to that testimony?
No, ma'am.
Do you affirm that the statements therein are correct and adopt revised excuse me, adopt Exhibit L as your sworn testimony here today?
I do.
Commissioners, I move admission of Exhibit L, including the data on pages 16, 17, Appendix A, and Exhibits L1 through L53.
Any objections, Mr. Rankin?
Mr. Examiner, Hearing Officer, I don't have any objections at this time. I'm going to ask Mr. Burkhead some questions about the work he did relative to the pre-existing petrophysical work that was done and on indirect testimony for Empire.
I would expect no less. Mr. Moander.
I'm sorry, Mr. Hearing Officer, I was conferring with some of my staff. Could I hear that question again?
Any objection to Exhibit L and all the attachments Ms. Shaheen rattled off?
No, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Mr. Beck
No objection.
and Pilot.
No objection.
All right. It will be admitted, Ms. Shaheen.
Thank you. Mr. Burkhead, let's start with, okay. I'm just figuring out why this is not working. Okay. Mr. Burkhead, let's start with a summary of your testimony. What are some of the deficiencies that you saw in Dr. Davidson's analysis?
Sure, I'm happy to go over that. Is there a way we can put this into slideshow mode so that I can read it a little more easily? I think I have the mouse, so I might be able to do it
Is it
myself.
not in slideshow mode? I think I'm going to have to stop sharing and try it again.
Actually, just at the very bottom there, Ms. Shaheen,
Uh-huh.
there's a little drop bar that says right next to it says 59%. To the left of it, it's
I
way at the
see.
bottom of your screen. Right next to it, there is that little box with a line that comes underneath it. Note to the left.
The left.
Go to the left, right, that one. Click on that.
Perfect.
And that should make it go into slideshow mode.
Interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let me stop sharing because I'm not sure what's going on here on my,
First shows up perfectly in slideshow mode. It's just that.
Sometimes things acts up, so.
okay.
It's the screen that's being shared.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get down
Okay,
there.
let's
quite
try
often.
it again.
Yeah, something like that. It's pretty. But we.
Someone on the
work in-
platform, please mute yourself. Thank you.
If I should do this. Sure. I don't know why it's not doing it.
Ms. Hardy, do you have it? Maybe you could try.
Or maybe you can come show me.
I'm sure I can continue on if this continues.
Let's see what we could get. We'll give it a minute more.
My eye is getting a little old. So So can I help her? Or-
Ms. Shaheen emailed it to me, so I can pull it up. I'm just waiting for the email to come through. Takes a minute with attachments.
There we go. Great. Okay. Okay, so my remit was to rebut Dr. Davidson's testimony, which required looking at the petrophysics, looking at the LAS files, and reading his testimony in detail. So within that, I've been able to find a few deficiencies that are definitely worthy of note. So one of the big ones is that Goodnight only used a small fraction of the available core data to build their model for the San Andreas. Dr. Davidson neglected obvious first-order data, such as visible and quantifiable oil volumes, fluorescence, oil odor in pits, streaming cut, floating oil in the cuttings box, and gas increases across the San Andreas interval. What this means, he explained this away in some pieces as organic matter or bitumen. I can show you directly in the further slides that they are direct evidence. With inconsistent and improperly picked tops, Goodnight's petrophysical model was calibrated on an incomplete section of the San Andreas, only the bottom part of the 679. When the correct San Andreas tops are used, Goodnight's interpretation would also include a San Andreas in the ROZ. And I know that was talked about a lot during the last session. What I would also say is that during while reading the testimony of Dr. Davidson, he goes into extreme length about what you would do if you had all the data possible to interpret a carbonate reservoir. The fact of the matter is we don't have all the data necessary to interpret a carbonate reservoir to the level that he suggests. We don't have sonic data in most of the wells. We can't calculate secondary porosity. We can't do detailed rock typing in this. So I'm going to basically talk about how we need to take care of our assumptions as we're doing this.
And what would an appropriate petrophysical approach look like here?
So using the correct petrophysical approach, along with the correct stratigraphic model, it illustrates a range of volumes, not just one single possibility. When we do this, in this case, it ends up with a continuous volume of hydrocarbons that actually meet the definition of an ROZ. But we don't just give one answer that automatically defeats the entire system. It's just not realistic. And part of the reason for this is that Goodnight falsely assumed that the San Andreas is non-reservoir from the very start, which basically led it into a saturation model that just assumes it's wet.
And does your petrophysical model integrate all of the available data?
Yes, ma'am. There's some data that I was not that I'm learning about now that I wasn't that I didn't see, but all the available data that was available to me at the time that showed indications I used.
And you've used that model to come up with a range of outcomes. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Next slide. What does this cross section show?
So this is, it's a little bit of a rehash of what Ryan went over, but it's just to illustrate the point of looking at a cross-section of more or less random wells through the MSU and including the Rhino, of how a level set, baseline set top of the Lovington sand in black across the log, along with Opstrelogic's tops, which are a certain distance, depending on the well, above the Lovington sand, and Goodnight's tops, which are sometimes above and below the Lovington sand. I don't care how much erosion you get from the top of the St. Andrews down to the Lovington sand. You can't still have the Lovington sand there and the top of the St. Andrews below it. So it has to be, the St. Andrews has to be on the top.
And for the record, I'll note that this is Exhibit L3. Turning to the next slide, Exhibit L9. What does this slide show and why is it important?
So it took me a while to figure out exactly from the testimony what exactly Dr. Davidson had been doing to get such high water saturations within the St. Andrews. It finally came to me when he actually showed his workflow looking at facies first. If facies are first, you're basically defining everything else based upon the rock type that you decide the reservoir is. In this case, if you look at this plot of resistivity index versus water saturation, this is my intention or my assumption of what Dr. Davidson used, that he used in his testimony. If you choose, he mentioned several times that there is deep water facies all throughout the St. Andrews and a large percentage of it. With that, he chooses that these are either basically wax stone or pack stone. If you look at these saturation curves that are circled in red, this ends up being the lowest water saturation you can get based on that resistivity ratio. So if you happen to call the entire St. Andrews deep water facies and happen to call it all wax stone, then your saturation can never be less than 92%. Meaning that there is absolutely no chance, he's not giving it a chance to even show an ROZ regardless of the resistivity, porosity, those things. Packstone, it's a little bit better. You can have an SW, you can have an SW less than around 64% at really high resistivity index ratios. But even then, it's already forcing the facies to not show an ROZ. And this is not this is not petrophysics, not without data to support it.
Turning to the next slide.
This is just an example of my total water saturation versus depth. What this shows, and I will say that the darker points are the North Monument, Grayburg, St. Andrews Unit 522, which I'm sure we're going to talk about later. But the lighter points behind it are all the EMSU saturations. I always use total water saturation to define things because in this situation, effective porosity is pretty much meaningless because it's a carbonated system with very little clay. So if we go into that case, then we shouldn't even be looking at phi E. It's phi T is really the important. Phi T and SWT are the important parts. We can see the low case and the high case. As Ryan had mentioned, my low case is based upon the core data that we have that is uncorrected. The high case is based upon a correction that I applied to it, based upon an ERGOBA paper from the 1980s, which I have the reference for in my documentation. And it uses B sub O and another factor for basically it's stripping out and bleeding out to the surface. We can look at that equation later if needed.
What is the significance of the red vertical lines?
The red vertical line just shows where basically a critical average. So the red line is at 60% water saturation. The blue line is at 80% saturation, oil saturation being 1 minus SWT. What we see is that the average for SWT across most of this is, in a lot of cases, exceeds 40% and certainly exceeds, in most cases, 20%.
And turning to the next slide, what do these mud logs show?
So the important part to these documents is, again, comes back to petrophysical integration. These are mud logs that cover the St. Andrews that when it was being drilled. So this includes gas curves from the gas chromatograph showing what levels of carbon molecules we have. It shows where there are shows. And it also gives cuttings descriptions as to what was seen when they put lighter fluid onto the samples to see if they'd have streaming cut, traces fluorescence, things like that. I know in this case, it's a little bit hard to read, so I put on the side what I'm seeing at those depths. Throughout this section, we see cut fluorescence on the EMSU 628. The top of the St. Andrews is noted on the log. In the 660, we see cut fluorescence and even oil odor on the pits. So if we want to talk about movable oil, yes, drilling the well, we are seeing movable oil at the surface. So I know that's not what we're talking about, but we're just seeing definite indications of hydrocarbons.
Why are these two mud logs important?
So there should be the one more.
Oh, one.
Can we advance? Yeah, there we go.
Oh, sorry.
I added this slide just as a way to reinforce this, and also because I really enjoyed the description from the EMSU 673, where from one of the samples they show heavily oil saturated as one of the descriptions. If we look at the 746, we also see oil smell at the pits, small amounts of oil floating in the box, trace microfracks, yellow fluorescence, and fresh cut. So definite indications, first order indications of hydrocarbons.
Next slide.
Please go ahead.
We saw these photos with Dr. Lindsay's testimony. Why are they important for your work?
This is a pass-through slide just to show that what petrophysics actually is an integration of all data. So what we use core, we use the core volumes, we use mud logs, we use cuttings descriptions, and we use the wireline. And from this, there is no doubt that we have oil within this reservoir.
Turning to the next slide.
So this is the EMSU 679. This is the start of some comparisons I'm going to show between Goodnight's interpretation and Empire Ops Geologic interpretation. The main thing I want to show is, aside from, I'll start from left to right. Say we have the gamma ray, resistivity, and density neutron. To the right of that, we have the interpreted curves, meaning the SWT high and low case. SWT low would be in the red in this case. And then the core data would be, and the uncorrected core data is in the track 9, and track 10 is the correction of the core data. You'll see that it's not a huge amount of correction that's been applied to it. It's something that's quite reasonable. And what I'd like to point out in this case is that Dr. Davidson and I agree in a lot of places in track 11, where his saturation in fuchsia and my saturation in red match quite well through the section. We clearly both agree in large part about things that are happening within the Grayberg. And with the new tops given, we also agree with what's happening at the very top of the San Andres, which is there's hydrocarbon there. What we don't see an agreement with is that the saturations Dr. Davidson shows drop off as soon as you get into their top of the San Andres. The point of the slide, or the image on the left, is a 51-year-old plot from a Core Labs training manual of a depleted oil reservoir zone, showing what happens when you have 30% oil saturation in a reservoir and you take a core. And what this shows is that when you have a depleted reservoir, the closest thing I can think of to what we would have here, aside from the ERGOPA paper that I saw, we can go from 30% oil saturation all the way down to 12%. So 12% saturation is not a deal killer. In fact, it's quite reasonable to explain what an ROZ would be.
Am I correct in understanding that the low case is based on the conventional core saturation?
Yes, ma'am.
And the high case is based on the corrected core saturation?
That is correct.
Next slide.
Okay, so this is just another comparison slide of Dr. Davidson's interpretation versus mine. I'm bad about keeping the same colors consistent, so I'll just describe to you what the colors are in each slide. So Dr. Davidson's SW is in green, mine is in blue, in this case for the low case saturation. Again, what you'll see is that in the little bit of Grayberg above and in the San Andres below, until you get to the Goodnight top of San Andres, we match really, really well. All of a sudden, as soon as you get into what is the Lovington sand, they've decided to change what facies they have, and the saturations have gone down to around 90-ish%, which is 90-ish% SW, which is, it just makes a big assumption.
And why do you believe Dr. Davidson's analyses differs here?
Because he's defining this as all deep water facies. Our porosities match below the San Andreas, whether you call it our San Andreas or their San Andreas, everything's the same. Resistivities are the same level above and below the above and below the San Andreas top. The only change that there is a change in the choice of facies being used.
And that relates to your previous discussion of the wax stone, packed stone. Is that
Yes,
right? Next slide.
This is the last comparison slide. I think this has the largest section of comparison. This is the EMSU 673 showing that, again, Dr. Davis and I largely agree in saturations. His is the green curve, mine in this case is the blue curve, that in some cases he actually has a lower water saturation than I do. And as soon as you get to the Lovington sand, just like clockwork, the saturations go down to about 90%. Whereas in mine, I am keeping the same model going, using the same interpretation style, not making a blanket change, and I'm still showing ROZ across that.
In your opinion, does this illustrate that Goodnight recognizes an ROZ in the San Andreas?
Absolutely. With the information that the San Andreas top was picked incorrectly, then they are definitely putting an ROZ into what is known as a San Andreas.
And does this slide also show porosity?
It does. So that is the other really important point, is you'll see through most of my rebuttal testimony and most of the logs that I put into my testimony, that you see a continuous porosity for all throughout the Lovington sand, all the way up into the Grayberg. This does not scream seal to me. What the technical definition of a seal, I believe, is 10 to the -6 Darcy. This is not what we're seeing. That is not the kind of rock we're seeing in the Lovington sand or anywhere within this range.
So if I understand correctly, the porosity here does not reflect a seal or other type of barrier that would impede fluid flow. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Next slide.
This is just to speak to the average oil saturations that I am calculating over this. Again, the way that we really need to look at, and this speaks to the doctor's questions earlier, that we really need to look at this in an uncertain way. We cannot look at this as one single value, as Dr. Davison is doing. Dr. Davison is giving one single value for oil in place and one single value for oil saturation across this. What we're doing is giving you a case that's based upon uncorrected data and a case that's based on corrected data. This is the start to providing uncertainty analysis for this and a Gaussian distribution, which we would go into with more Monte Carlo analysis. So in this case, the averages, just putting a rough line through it, are about 30% oil saturation in the low case and about 40% oil saturation in the high case. What is the answer for real? It's probably somewhere in between. We can't just use the high case or the low case unless we understand it in the case and understand it within the context of probability.
Next slide.
This is a composite slide to go with the previous one. Dr. Davidson commonly asserts within his testimony that there's that there isn't a high enough level of saturation or a tall enough level of porous interval to describe a raw zone. The Empire Ops geologic interpretation clearly shows that it is highly possible and more likely, and definitely within the range of the low and the high case, to have a very continuous level of ROZ throughout the entire San Andreas, or much of the San Andreas.
And can you tell the commissioners what you mean by net pay?
Net pay is a really esoteric term that has a lot of different meanings. In this case, net pay means that with a CO2 flood, we would be able to move some of this ROZ. So it would not be conventionally producible, but in this case, we believe that it would be something that CO2 would be able to flood into and help to move.
Turning to the final slide.
This is a roll-up of the OOIP on the low case and the high case. Again, you can look at either. The answer is somewhere in between. The important part that I wanted to point out is that if you look at the tracks, the columns on the right, on the far right, the one to the left is Goodnight's OIP using their tops and as reported in their testimony. And then I went through and calculated that again using our tops to show what the difference would be. In this case, because our tops were the same in the Rhino, the OIP doesn't change. From that point on, it starts to change a little bit. So in EMSU 746, we go from 13.3 to 14.78. EMSU 713 had barely any San Andreas, so it's hard to, that it's not a striking difference. But then in the EMSU 673, we go from 3.1 million barrels to 8.94. And this is using their analysis of what's there. EMSU 660, we go from 2.7 to 5.84. EMSU 628, 6.8 to 8.4, and in 658 from 0 to 5.31. This is a striking difference and an admission that since the tops of the San Andreas are actually shallower than originally picked, that there is an ROZ in the San Andreas.
And just to be clear, when you refer to OOIP
It's original oil in place
and MMBO,
is millions of barrels of oil.
thank you. I have no further questions at this time. I'm past the witness.
Perfect timing, Ms. Shaheen. Let's see, we're right at 3 o'clock. I'm sure you planned it that way. So let's take a 15-minute break. We'll be back at 3:15. Okay, folks, time for the virtual gavel again. Ms. Apodaca, do we have a court reporter?
We're on the record.
Okay, great. Are you ready to proceed, Mr. Rankin?
Yes, Mr. Hearing Officer.
All right.
Good afternoon, Mr. Burkhead. How are you today? Good. Let's see. So I think I'm probably going to start with your just identifying your rebuttal statement here. I got here on the screen as soon as I share it. Your rebuttal statement, which is marked as Exhibit 11 L. It's Exhibit L. And as with your colleagues, I excerpted it from the packet overall, and I'll just confirm with you that this is your signature, and it's February 10th, 2025, and this is that goes on for another numerous pages with your exhibits to a total of 78. Does this represent your Exhibit L that you submitted?
It appears to, yes.
Okay. Just want to kind of get a sense for your background as well. I didn't know. I don't know what your tech is, but what is your tech?
ERTech is the Unconventional Resources Executive Technical Conference. So it's a conference that's happening for the last 10 years or so that talks about everything unconventional. So from petrophysics to completions to geochemistry. And I help with the petrophysical section of that for the past, this will be my third year helping with that.
So it's focused on unconventional petrophysics?
Unconventional resources in general.
Okay, resources. Got it. Okay. And then these are overviews of the regions that you've worked in. As for the U.S., a range across different basins, it looks like, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry.
And I guess if you would just summarize for me, it looks like you also came out of the Anadarko, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And what was your, and at Anadarko, you did petrophysics as well?
Yes.
Okay. And looks like you did work in a wide variety of areas overseas as well as domestic. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
They had me working everything.
Yeah. And in terms of the U.S., while you were at Anadarko, did you work in the Permian?
Yes, a little bit.
Okay.
Not excessively was my main area, but over the 15 to 16 years I was there, it was a fair amount.
It was a fair amount to work in the Permian?
Yes.
Okay. And in the Delaware Basin?
Yes.
Okay. On the Texas side, New Mexico side?
It was on the Texas side.
Up on the Central Basin platform?
A little bit. It was mostly scoping sort of things. It wasn't an asset that I was maintaining.
Okay. So the work you did on the Central Basin platform was, as you put it, scoping potential assets or scoping assets?
That's what I recall. It would have been quite a while ago. It would have been like pre-2012.
Okay. And when you were doing that with the prospects in what formations do you recall?
I know I had looked at the San Andreas Yates. I've looked at the Wolf Camp. I've done a significant amount of study in the Wolf Camp. So just kind of the general formations, Brushy Canyon, that sort of.
Okay. Again, that was all on the Texas side, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
How about in the Grayburg?
Sorry.
How about the Grayburg?
I did not look at the Grayburg while at Anadarko, but I have done significant looks at it since then.
Okay. Let me scooch up here. I'm mostly, as you can tell, trying to figure out your experience relative to what we're doing here.
Yes.
Okay. So after Anadarko, you went to a firm or group called I'm going to butcher the name, DeGollier and McNaughton?
Yes.
Okay. And it was an independent consultancy?
It is. It's equivalent to Netherlands Sewell.
It's what?
It's equivalent to Netherlands silver.
Got it. Understood. So you're doing, in that role, you were doing a lot of reserve estimates?
Yes, reserve petrophysics.
Okay. In collaboration with geologists?
Correct.
Okay. And it looks like you did, you were there for approximately 2 years. What regions or zone, fields did you work on while you were there?
It was largely the lion's share of it was Russia and residual hydrocarbons and trying to do water floods. We had saturations of say like 10 to 15% oil saturation we're trying to get out of the ground.
Okay. What kind of reservoirs were they?
They were mixed, but they were clastic and there were some carbonates, if I
Okay.
remember correctly. It was over a very large area.
And these were water floods, you said?
Yes.
Okay. So they were looking to water flood.
They wanted the last drop.
They wanted the last drop. Clastics and carbonates, right?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I recall.
Okay. Then these all separate employments, or are these different projects you did within?
So as I mentioned, I own a consulting company. These are all different clients that I've had while owning that consultancy.
Okay, so that's Petrobrain?
That is Petrobrain.
Okay. And just let's see, without going through each and every one of them, looks like there's a fair number of CCUS or carbon capture and sequestration, utilization and sequestration projects. Is that right?
Yes, I've been working a number of CO2 projects.
Okay. Those are mostly in the US, or are they abroad as well?
So far, those have all been in the US.
Okay. Are you seeing more CCUS projects than you are ROZ projects?
Yes.
Yeah. Is that because of the incentives to tax incentives for CCUS?
I would hate to
Speculate.
guess on their motivations, but
You're just looking at your projects here. It looks like I'm seeing CCUS, but I'm not seeing ROZ, right?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So the carbonate systems that you have worked on, that would be at least the one field or fields in Russia where you're working on water flood development.
Yes.
Where else have you worked on carbon?
Brazil. I've worked in a few, let's see, Mississippi lime. I mean, just a lot of the typical limestone lime fields. Oklahoma. I'm bad with formation names, so I can always look those up.
What kind of developments were those that you were working in? Were they horizontal drilling, or what kind of?
Both. They were horizontal and they were vertical. So there was the ones in Brazil were heavy oil, large porosity. Oh, actually, no. So I'm sorry, I misspoke. The ones in Brazil that were carbonates were subsalt.
So they're
medium porosity.
Okay. Those were, but that was a horizontal play?
No, that was vertical.
Vertical play, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. And on the CO2 injection that you identify here in your summary, that CO2 injection has it been limited to the CCUS side of CO2?
It has. There are CO2 projects that have not been greenlit yet by the EPA or by states that have been given primacy.
Okay, so there's projects that are in the development stage for carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration.
Correct.
Okay, so class 6.
Yes, class 6.
Okay. On the UIC program, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, and all in all, basically, you've got 20 some odd years of doing petrophysics work in a variety of backgrounds and fields, correct?
Correct.
Okay, but more limited on the carbonate side. Is that fair?
A little more limited on the carbonate side, but it's all petrophysics.
Okay, and none so far on ROZ, correct?
Aside from this one, no.
Okay,
but I would say I have seen residual oil before, but I've not been on an ROZ project.
Mm-hmm,
so.
Mm-hmm. When you say you've seen ROZ before, was it part of I mean, obviously the Russia one you mentioned where you're looking to target oil saturations in the 10 to 15% range. I guess those are from conventional core saturations, or how are you characterizing those oil saturations?
These are core saturations. Then there's been lots and lots of production. So it's more about stating like what the saturation likely is to be now with whatever new wells we have.
Okay. So besides that Russian experience, where else have you looked at or explored or looked for or evaluated residual oil?
Well, I know I said I had seen residual oil. One of the cases was a well in Ghana where we drilled a well and it was full of just basically an ROZ.
And in that case, did the operator pursue that ROZ interval?
No, because right next door there was a play that had several billion barrels of oil that had 30% porosity and was 90% oil saturated.
Okay. So that right next door, there were wells with 90% oil saturation, which you would characterize as conventional saturation.
Yes. Yeah. It was a conventional play.
Okay. And so have you worked on any tertiary recovery projects, just to be clear, whether it's ROZ or post-secondary recovery?
No.
Okay. And we talked a little about your experience on carbonate systems. Have you worked on in a carbonate ramp system like the EMSU?
I couldn't say with certainty, but I believe I've done a lot of research into them over the years.
Okay.
So, but I can't say exactly what the environment was.
Okay. So nothing as you're sitting here comes to mind that's
nothing that I can put my finger on and say, I know for sure that was a carbonate ramp under oath.
Got it.
Okay.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. I think I got a handle on all that. Now, jumping up to your testimony. Let's see if my mouse is working. The bottom of page 2 of your testimony, I've highlighted a statement here where under paragraph 8, you say there are significant indications shown in the following document that validate the likelihood of an ROZ in the St. Andrews of Eunice Monument South. Just want to ask a couple questions about this. What stuck out to me when I read the sentence was what I term qualifiers. The first one is indications, and it's not exactly a strong statement, but what do you mean by when you say indications? And I understand you're going to point me to the direct evidence and the interpretations you've done, but I guess I would just like to know when you say indications what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'd say if you're talking, you may not have spoken to a petrophysicist before, but this is the way that we talk.
Yeah,
there's always a caveat.
Yeah.
The answer to a lot of our questions about what do you do in this case is it depends.
Yeah.
But in this case, what you do in this case is you look at the indications for oil, which the undeniable indications are oil in the core, oil that's seen in the pits and within the cuttings, fluorescence, cut, those things, and increased gas that's right across the zone. So that, along with the logs, which do require a complex understanding of what's going on to reach the saturations that are shown by the core and that we see in the ROZ, you've got to look at all the pieces of data that you can.
Okay. That would include as well well tests or any production tests that may
So
have.
I would stop right there a little bit. The whole point of an ROZ is you don't see oil during a test.
Okay, well, I understand that. I guess, and that's the case if the oil is truly at a residual saturation, right?
Well, we're parsing definitions of it's. I'm saying if it's an ROZ, it's not going to have oil flowing. You're saying what if it's not an ROZ? So I'm not sure how to answer that.
Well, I think I'm sure we'll get down to brass tacks on that.
Yeah, I'm not.
We'll get down to it. But I guess my point is well, let me ask you a question. I mean, I understand you're working under the assumption that the definition of a residual oil zone is oil saturations from 20 to 40%. Is that fair?
I'm working on the assumption that 20% is kind of what is written in literature, but I'm not working on the assumption that is the lowest it can go.
Okay. Are you aware of any ROZ plays anywhere in the Permian Basin that have targeted oil saturations below 20%?
I am not.
Okay. Now, very good. And now, and on the upper end, I mean, what would you describe, define a residual interval?
I appreciate the question. That it depends. It depends upon the wettability. It depends upon the rock properties. You can have residual oil up to 50%. A standard range could be anywhere from 30 to 50, dependent upon the wettability and the oil type. So we're looking at a mixed oil wet system. You can have pretty high residual oil values that aren't going to flow unless you put some external means on it to move it.
All right. There's a lot to unpack in there, and I'm going to work on you.
Okay.
Not work on you. I'm going to work with you.
Well,
Okay. To unpack it. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds better.
Okay. So I know wettability has been an issue. It is an issue. Okay. In these complex carbonate systems, and it's an issue because the wettability has a lot, will dictate a lot about how the oil behaves, right? In the rock, in the pores. And in here, I understood you to say that it's your understanding that in this EMSU carbonate system, we're dealing with a mixed oil wet system, right?
No, I said mixed wet to oil wet.
Mixed wet to oil wet. Okay.
There have not been, to my knowledge, there have not been any tests done in the San Andreas for wettability within the MSU. And that's an important point, that it has to be within the MSU because the oil is specific to here and the pore types are specific, and the geology is specific to here. We can say by the way that the resistivity behaves, it certainly behaves in a mixed wet to oil wet fashion.
Okay. I'm sure we may come back to that, but I just wanted to get your understanding of what the wettability was in the system. Okay. Now, basically, depending on, and I'm a lawyer, so when you use the word depends, people joke about lawyers' answers, right? It's always, it depends. So I'm not foreign to that. But you're telling me that you're working on the assumption that the low end is 20% and the high end is going to be around 50%, but it depends on the wettability.
It depends on the wettability. It depends upon, it depends on several factors.
Okay, so now on the wettability question, okay, how does wettability affect the high end of your definition of an RZ?
Say the more oil wet and the lower API you have of oil, the higher saturation you have to have before it'll start to move.
Okay, slow down a little bit for me. Say it again. Sorry.
Sure. The more oil wet it is, the more it sticks to the sides of the pores, and the lower the API of the oil, the less gassy it is, the harder time you're going to have getting it to move.
Right. Okay.
Sorry, I've always spoken fast. Please feel free to tell me to slow down.
Understood. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So basically, the reason, as I understand, in these Mother Nature water flood systems, okay, where you have potentially a potentially saturated formation that at some point in geologic time had been or may have been saturated with oil, 60, 70, 80%, whatever the saturations may have been. And then during the uplift that was experienced, causing the hydraulic head to flow water through the Grayburg and San Andreas, we had multiple pore volumes sweeping, stripping some of the lighter ends off your oil, and basically converting your system from to a more oil wet system. Is that right? Is that your understanding of how the Mother Nature's water flood?
That is my understanding. Is that yes?
So in a system that had been heavily swept by multiple pore volumes, you're likely to see a more oil wet system, right?
I can't say that as a universal thing.
Okay. But in a system like the San Andreas, where it's been swept by dozens of pore volumes, I mean, isn't that generally what you would expect to see in the San Andreas, in the MSU, with the multiple pore volumes that Dr. Trentham and Mr. Melzer have discussed in their written testimony?
From what I understand, in the San Andreas, the multiple pore volumes of fluid have assisted in making the system oil wet. Everything that starts out not as a source rock will start off as water wet, but it will have an affinity to oil wetness in certain carbonates.
Okay, understood. No, I appreciate that. So that, I mean, I don't know if that was helping anybody else, but I just want to make sure I understood, where you're coming from and where you're concept was of the current status of the EMSU system and the wettability of it. Okay. Shifting back to where we were. So in the next sentence here, the second half of the sentence that I've highlighted, you say that petrophysical interpretation of the wells reveals oil saturations that fall within the range of an RZ, right? I mean, that's what we were just discussing, right?
Yes.
And I guess that was why I was asking you these questions, because I wanted to understand what your understanding of the range of an RZ is. And so as I take it, it's a little bit, 20% up to 50%, and depending on wettability. Now,
Yeah, and the reason why I'm a little cagey about the 20% is because we don't know what the technical limit is. It could be lower than that. So just to.
Okay, I'll come back. I may come back to that to ask you what you mean by that, because I may come back to that. I don't think you addressed that in your testimony, but I'll see if I have time to come back to that. Okay. Okay. Now, in your testimony that you submitted and that your analysis that you've done, is it your opinion that the RZ you've identified that is an indication? Now, let me back up. In this first sentence I was discussing with you, I talked about, I saw some qualifiers. The first one was indications. Okay, we talked about that one.
Mm-hmm.
The next qualifier is that I see is this word likelihood.
Mm-hmm.
So what I read is that you say there's significant indications of a likelihood of an ROZ. So it sounds like that there's that this, and I guess you mean by this document you mean your testimony, right?
Yes.
Yeah, this document, your testimony. So what I understand you to say is that your testimony, you believe your testimony validates the likelihood that there's an ROZ in the San Andres. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So that, I mean, just trying to frame it. So yeah. What you're comfortable saying is that you're validating the likelihood of an RZ in the San Andres.
So what I am, perhaps some background is important. In the oil industry, we deal with probabilities. We don't deal with certainties. The more data we have, the more likely we are to have a certainty. So until we have the absolute certainty, we keep using words like this, and we deal with ranges, which is why I had a low case and a high case. Mm-hmm. So that is the primary reason for those kinds of adjectives.
Got it. And I appreciate it. And you understand why I'm having that discussion with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in your oil saturations, in your analysis that you've conducted, have you interpreted oil saturations that go above your 50% depending range for an ROZ?
I'm sure there are.
Yeah. But you still call those, you're still calling it an ROZ with those higher oil saturations?
I am not calling them anything. I am saying that is the overall log interpretation. I'm looking at the averages.
Okay. Okay, yeah, you don't want to be defined by labels, right? I mean, you're just looking for what you think the oil saturations are and where they are.
Yes.
Okay, and you're not going to ascribe a label to it. You're just going to tell us where they are and how much you think there is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now you likely heard some of my discussions with your colleague and about some of the questions about mobility. And of course, you can understand why we're all wondering about it. Do you have an opinion on at what oil saturation oil would become mobile?
It is an incredibly dependent answer. I think what I mentioned before was that around 30 to 50% oil saturation is probably when it would start to move a little bit. But based on real perm, it'd be just a tiny, tiny fraction of the fluid movement. You'd have to have a significant higher saturation to move larger volumes of hydrocarbons.
What was that last part you said?
If you look at relative permeability,
yeah,
only a very small fraction of the fluid would move once it reaches that point. A very small fraction of the hydrocarbon would move once it reaches that point. with the fraction increasing, the higher the saturation is.
Okay, so you used a term called relative permeability, and I have a layman's understanding of that term. And one of my questions is did you prepare a permeability curve?
I prepared three.
Three.
Yeah.
So three different relative perm curves?
No, that's relative permeability.
Okay.
And permeability are not the same thing.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, I'm with you. So
Yeah.
you prepared three different perm curves. Did you prepare a relative perm curve as well?
No,
No. Okay.
that requires detailed core testing, detailed core analysis.
Okay. So tell me about the perm curves then that you prepared.
They are stock equations based upon the Lucia classification of rock types. There's a type 1, type 2, and type 3 based upon varying qualities. So as I mentioned before, Dr. Davidson made a generalization as to the rock type throughout the entire San Andreas with very little, with I think it was 95% of it being deep water facies. I can't make that call. That it's irresponsible to actually call the entire reservoir one type without having enough data for it. So I gave options for three different permeabilities.
Okay. Did you, those were just stock equations, so you didn't actually generate or produce your own permeability curve then?
No.
Okay, got it.
It wasn't part of the remit.
Just so again, these are coming from me, so I'm a layman, but the permeability curves, are those vertical perms or horizontal?
Those are typically known to be horizontal perms.
Horizontal perms. All three of those types are horizontal perms.
Yes.
Okay. So did you not use then any vertical perm in your assessment of the
there was no requirement to calculate a vertical perm. What we can see is the continuity of the porosity, which the porosity is going to be a direct relationship to permeability. So if you want to say that there's a relationship, a continuous porosity infers a decent vertical perm.
I don't mean to take us down a sidetrack here, but this kind of relates to a question I had, because I think in your well logs you included baffles.
I put potential baffles.
And those baffles, I mean, wouldn't those have to be based on a vertical perm?
The baffles if you have zero. So vertical perm is the composite of all the horizontal perms. So I think it's the geometric average of all the horizontal perms. So if you can infer that by saying that there is a bit of horizontal permeability or porosity that is below a certain percent, you can say maybe this can be a baffle.
Okay, so you inferred your baffle flags based on your determination of the horizontal perms in those locations.
Based upon the lithology, based upon the porosity, and based upon the look of the logs.
Okay. Okay. Little sidetrack.
Yep.
Okay. When I get down sidetracks, it takes me a moment to get back. Sorry, one moment. Okay. While we're on the logs, okay, and the cores, I have a couple I want to back up to ask you a couple more sort of overview questions, okay, before I forget about them. I think I understood from your colleague, Mr. Bailey, that OPS was retained in September. Is that right?
Ops geologic?
Yeah, Ops geologic, sorry.
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. So do you understand, what was your understanding about why you were retained by Empire? What did they ask you to do?
I was brought into Empire by Ops geologic to look at the testimony and do a petrophysical evaluation of the San Andreas, which in order to rebut the testimony, you have to do your own interpretation.
You were provided the analyses, petrophysical analyses that were conducted by New Tech. Is that correct?
Yes.
And as I understand, you were provided both the original analysis that New Tech prepared as part of its August 2024 testimony, as well as its revised petrophysical analysis that was submitted in December, correct?
Yes, I received that a few weeks ago.
Okay. And have you reviewed and analyzed the new text analysis in both its original and revised?
It wasn't part of my remit, but I did browse look at it to see where it fit into mine.
Okay. And what was your determination about how it fit into yours?
My determination is that it fit well within the range, from what I could tell, of what I was calculating as a high and a low case.
Do you understand what inputs and parameters NewTek employed to conduct its petrophysical analysis?
I have read a lot of their documentation, so I can refresh myself on some of it, but yes, I did read through it.
Do you understand that NewTek, when it prepared its revised analysis, calibrated its petrophysical analysis to the water saturations in the EMSU 679 well?
I do not understand that.
Okay, what is your understanding about how
I don't know if they did it to the oil saturation or the water saturation.
Okay.
I don't recall which one they said they calibrated to.
If they had calibrated it to the water saturation, what would your response be to that?
That would definitely be a high case estimate.
Mm-hmm. Why is that?
Because the core loses fluid as it goes up. As we said, it loses oil and it loses water. So you could use since both of them lose fluids, you could use the core oil saturation as the ultimate low case, and you could in theory use the core water saturation as the ultimate high case.
And the reason, just explain for us lay people how the water saturation is related to the oil saturation.
Well, because of the way that they clean the cores.
And no, sorry, backing just more simply than that, because oil saturation is 1 minus water saturation, right?
Yes.
Some basically. So like I use the word inverse, but
yeah, inverse is not that would make it a percentage. So
Mr. Bailey didn't like that. But essentially you can derive your oil saturation if you know your water saturation, correct?
Depending if you have a 2 fluid system.
Okay, and that's the assumption, right, that we're all operating under in petrophysics, right?
When you bring up a core, you're no longer in a 2 fluid system.
Okay.
But it starts out as that.
Okay. So, so you just perused NewTek's analyses, but you didn't study it.
I didn't revise on it for a weekend. So
okay, and so yeah, you didn't get into it well enough to even understand how they calibrated or what inputs and parameters they used.
Not to be able to state with assurance today what they did, as what curves they calibrated to.
And Empire didn't tell you what they had done either.
I read Galen's documentation.
Okay,
I just can't speak to it at the moment without looking at it.
Understand. And so because of that, you can't tell me how your analysis is different than theirs.
I can say that looking at his SW curve, it seems to fall within the range in general of what my low and high case are.
And when you're talking about his analysis, can you tell me which one? Because I mentioned there's 2. There's an original one, and then there's
sorry.
one done.
I see. It would be the most recent analysis.
Okay. And you're saying that falls within the range of your which one? Your high or low?
It's a range.
It's a range.
Yeah.
So it falls within the range of the high and low. Got it. I'm with you.
Mhm.
Okay. Now on to what you've done. Did you calibrate your petrophysical analysis to, as I understand it, you calibrated to the 2 cores that are available, right?
Yes.
And those would be the 679, EMSU 679, and the North Monument St. Andrews 522 well, right?
No, it is the Arabelle and the 679. I did recently look at the North Monument.
Okay. Okay. Now, how, just for my benefit, explain to me just at a high level how you calibrate those 2 cores to your petrophysical analysis.
So varying M and N, as Davidson and I both completely agree that to use a model, although Davidson used a model that didn't require N directly, you need to vary both because it's a complex carbonate system. So what I did was looked at the cores and I tied to the core oil saturation to the maximum of the core oil saturations that I saw on the log. And then did a correction to that based on the Ergebach correction that was published in the 80s to get to a corrected oil saturation, and then use that as my high case. So effectively what I did was I used the Archie phi t equation because we were in a clay-free system, and Archie should work just fine with a variable m and a variable n. So that is actually upheld by Dr. Davidson's plots that he shows, that you can still use Archie in those cases. You just have to vary those properties. So the n was varied, and the linear relationship to a non-linear relationship for one of the cases to make it match the core corrected case, to give us the high case possibility.
Explain, if you would, the correction that you applied. And I think was that the image I saw in the summary summary that you presented? There was an image discussing core corrections.
That is that's from the 1968, I believe, and that's how long ago they actually. And it was published in a 1973 core lab manual.
Okay, but the guidance you were following for the core correction was from 1980. That
is from the 1980s. The reference is from Ergebach. It's on my testimony.
Yeah, okay. So just if you would, just so I understand it, explain what was the correction that you did.
It uses a correction for fluid loss and a correction for oil expulsion and a correction for gas expulsion based on the B sub O that we're given.
Based on what?
Based on the B sub O that we have.
Okay. And the B sub O was provided to you by Empire, correct?
Yes.
And that's the oil volume factor,
formation
factor.
Yeah.
Okay. Understanding that you were provided a value from Empire, what's the normal process for determining the B sub O?
That is outside. That is an engineering thing. I don't typically calculate B sub Os myself.
Do you know how it's done?
Aside from in the lab, I couldn't tell you the exact process.
Okay. Is it generally specific, formation specific, location specific?
It's typically fluid specific.
Fluid specific. So you'd need to know like the API, the gravity, the gas content, that kind of thing of the oil, or is that basically what we're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that wasn't or hasn't been available for the San Andreas, correct?
Not that I have seen.
So do you know what went with the value that Empire gave you, what it was based on, where it came from?
No, I do not.
Okay. You don't know if it's where it's from or anything.
It came from Daryl, the engineer.
Okay. You didn't ask him where it came from or what the basis was for it.
I think I did, and it was this is what we're using.
Okay.
As a best case, or as a not even as a best. No, sorry, not as a best case, but just this is what we're using.
Okay. Obviously, I mean, you use B sub O in your work, right?
Only when calculating the oil in place, which is not part of the typical everyday petrophysical process. We're worried about what's down there at the time.
Okay. So because it's not typical or normal for you to do that, you're mostly doing interpretations. Do you have a sense for the reasonableness of the B sub O that he gave you?
I think it's a very good relative B sub O to use. If we use one that's lower, then the amount of oil we have goes way up. So in order to keep the OIP from just exploding, so if we put in a B sub O that's lower, the oil saturation the oil in place just goes higher.
Okay. So based on the output, you feel like it was a reasonable.
I think it's a reasonable mid-case scenario.
Okay.
Mr. Rankin,
Yeah.
This is a good place. Looks like you're about to change subjects. We just need to take a 5 or 10 minute break.
Mr. Harwood, I think a 5 to 10 minute break, let's say 10.
Okay, let's say 10.
That's fine. Thanks.
So we'll come back at 4:05. Okay, folks, let's, Ms. Apodaca, do we have the court reporter ready to get us back on the record?
We're on the record.
All right, Mr. Rubin?
Thank you, Mr. Harwood, Mr. Hearing Officer. Yes, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, it occurs to me, I think there is a necessity that we go into closed session for the remainder of today for purposes of discussing this pending adjudicatory matter. It is of some concern to me that we change horses perhaps in midstream, but I would like to discuss that in a confidential manner with the parties. So, and of course, I regret any inconvenience to the parties right now, but what I would like to do is have if a motion is granted to go into closed session, that we have the room cleared for the day and that, we'd see you all back at 9. So if I could have a motion to go into closed session pursuant to section 1015-1H1 and 3 for the purposes of deliberating on this pending adjudicatory matter. Can I have this so moved?
I move.
I second.
And can I have a roll call vote?
Aye. Approved. If you want, or
Aye.
Okay. So we are now in closed session. You all get to leave early for the day, special treat. And we will see you all here at 9.
Can I leave?
You especially. No, yes, you do have to leave.